About 15 seconds. Okay, thumbs up, you ready? Okay. You will hear the music fade out, and I will just tell you go when you're here. Go.
Good evening. Welcome to episode number 15 of True Talks with Project Managers. This is a live stream talk show co-sponsored by PMI Southern Maryland and PMI WDC. I'm Beth May, and I'm delighted to be your MC tonight. Please note that tonight's show is being recorded. It will be available on PMI Southern Maryland's YouTube channel, where you can also find previous episodes, including the show we did live from the PMI DMV Symposium in September. That was fun. Our topic for tonight is risk and managing uncertainty. In my experience, everyone does risk management at some level, whether we realize it or not. However, taking an intentional approach to risk management can significantly improve project performance. So this is an important topic. The person who manages all of the technical risk for this show is our producer, Dan Stay. In this season of Giving Thanks, I'd like to give my thanks to Dan for his support. Dan will also be monitoring the YouTube chat for your questions and
Check
comments.
Your headroom. I need your camera tilted up, please.
Our True Talk host is Kendall Lott. Kendall is the CEO and president of Empowered Strategies, host of the podcast PM Point of View, and co-founder and chairman for the nonprofit Project Management for Change.
Or did you freeze?
Kendall has hosted this show since its inception almost 2 years ago. His guests tonight are Dr. Jamie Monat and Professor Susan Parente. Dr. Monat is a director and professor of practice at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts. He performs research and teaches several courses, including operations risk management,
a little bit, please.
systems thinking, and system optimization. Previously, Dr. Monat served as president of Harvard Clinical Technology and has served in multiple corporate roles. He is also co-author of the book, Using Systems Thinking to Solve Real-World Problems. Professor Parente is an author, speaker, mentor, and teacher focused on risk management and project management. She is a principal consultant at S3 Technologies, LLC, and an associate professor at Post University, Montclair State University, and the University of Virginia. She has 15 professional certifications and more than 25 years experience leading software and business development projects in the private and public sectors. She is also co-author of 2 books, including Hybrid Project Management, Lighting the Path of Project Uncertainty with Agile and Hybrid Methods. Kendall, I'm excited for the insights that we'll be getting from Dr. Monat and Professor Parente. Please take it away.
Hey there, Beth. I think I'm on camera now. Did it happen? Did I appear? I wasn't sure how much risk there was. I managed to fall off the feed, so you never know what the backup plan is here. I'm getting a little feedback there. Dan, are you picking that up? Dan? Good. Excellent. I'm glad to be here. So anyway, thanks for the intro there, Beth, and for covering all that ground for us. But welcome to our audience post-symposium live, but not in person here tonight, with our joint Southern Maryland and Washington, D.C. True Talks session here. Beth, I wanted to catch up with you on something, though, because you had some pretty interesting news, and you've been a guest talking about this in a couple of different contexts. What's up with PIMDOS? PM Days of Service here.
Well, thank you for asking, Kendall. Our next DC Regional Project Management Day of Service will be on February 18th. It will be virtual on WebEx. And in addition to, and registration for that event will open for nonprofits the first week of December, I think December 5th, and registration for PMs will open in January. You can check our website for more information, www.pm4change.org. In addition, there is a Project Management Day of Service in New Zealand tomorrow and in South Africa next week. So that's pretty exciting.
So buy your airline tickets now. It's tomorrow, guys. Get on the plane. Get going. You got to get going to it. But if you missed that one, you have one for next week. But anyway, it is international, which is consistent with our whole project management profession itself. So I'm happy about that, and congratulations for what you've been able to lead there and cause to happen there. So PM Arati out there in the audience. If you don't ask questions, we can't answer them. So we've got people monitoring the YouTube chat. So go ahead and pop your questions in there as we move through tonight so that we can pick the ones that we want to be able to pick, share your thoughts. So we'll be able to pick what we can to feed into our stream. So with that, risk. So we got your risk and we got its twin, the area of opportunity. So we're going to tackle some of that tonight. Now, I wanted to put my own editorial in here about why I like talking about risk, and Beth hit on it. And it's something that I've run across in my discussions with folks, which is this. Once you've done the blocking and tackling of project management and some of the project management tools, one of the coolest things is you realize what you really are is a risk manager. Whether you're doing formal risk management or not, you're actually mitigating, understanding, and communicating what's going to happen in a future, an untold future. A future that we don't know what's happening yet. So it's inherently risky. There's no case where it's not. So to do project management past the very basic parts is in fact to be a risk manager. And the other thing that I find important and why you might be interested in finding out some new tools or techniques is the risk drives decision-making for executives. You want to be able to describe how others can understand the decisions that need to be made on your projects. So we know it really matters. It matters at a program level and at a corporate level and an executive level. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and bring on Dr. Jamie Monat. Jamie, are you out there? We've heard your bio, so come on up.
Here.
Are you here?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay, now I can see you, but I've got to ask you. Beth went through your bio there a little bit, and it's quite impressive, of course, with many years. We won't say how many necessarily in this field doing what it needs to do. But I noticed on your thing that in your many experiences, it includes separations. And I was dying to know medical devices. I know what those are. Food and beverage, I have a sense of that. Consulting, I'm with you there. But separations, what are we talking about?
Separations is basically filtration, centrifugation, things like that, Kendall. For example, if you have an oil-water mixture, a wastewater, that has emulsified oil in the water, and it has to be treated as wastewater and is expensive to treat, you want to separate the emulsified oil from the water. And you can do that with a variety of techniques like filtration, ultrafiltration, centrifugation, etc. So I worked in that field for gosh, I think it was 20 odd years.
Well, as soon as you started talking, I was suddenly afraid I had asked. And then you kept talking and I realized, wait a second, that's an inherently risky environment. You're dealing with getting the good stuff separated from the bad stuff, or perhaps some explosive stuff or flammable stuff from non-flammable. So it sounds like you've been embedded in an industry's functioning around and focusing on risk for some time.
That's true, although I have to say that during the period I was working in separations, I didn't know anything about risk management, and I didn't start to study that. I didn't start to study that until I got into academia.
So there we go. So there you were wandering the halls of academia looking for something to be curious about. And all of a sudden you decided it was going to be on risk. So what made you want to even think about risk?
Well,
what's the context for that?
I didn't know anything about it. And when Worcester Polytechnic Institute was kind enough to hire me, they offered me a menu of courses to teach. And One of them happened to be project management, which I knew a little bit about, and one of them happened to be risk management, which I knew nothing about. So I figured it would be fun to learn, and it has been a great deal of fun to learn about risk management and all the good approaches toward risk management and all the bad approaches to risk management as well, of which there are many, in my opinion.
Oh, wait, whoa. No. We gotta back up on that just a little bit here. What would you classify as a bad approach to risk management? And tell me you didn't get taught it in project management.
The bad approach to risk management, and my pet peeve, is the use of the heat map risk matrix for prioritizing project risks, which is just an abysmal, terrible tool that should not be used. In fact, should be expunged from the face of the earth.
Okay, well, there's a little tension in that statement there. So you've got this thesis that we should get rid of the heat map. You don't like the idea that some things are labeled as worse, or what's going on there?
No, I don't.
What's the principle you're against?
Look, it's entirely appropriate to try to prioritize risks. What are the most significant risks and the ones that we need to worry about the most versus which are the insignificant risks and ones that we don't need to worry about? It's a reasonable question to ask. Well, and the risk matrix attempts to do this. So let me just describe what the risk matrix is just to make sure we're all talking from the same page. The standard heat map risk matrix has two axes. One is typically the probability of a risk occurring, and that's usually on a 0 to 100% scale or a 0 to 1 scale. And the other axis is the impact of the risk. And that's usually presented as a dollar amount. And the dollar amounts could range from $0 up to millions or billions or even trillions of dollars. So you have this matrix with probability on one axis, impact on the other axis, and then those risks that are deemed to have a high impact and a high probability are coded red, and those that have a low impact and a low probability are coded green with intermediary colors like yellow, orange, etc. And it sounds perfectly logical, right? Sounds perfectly reasonable. Everybody uses it. It's sanctioned by the PMI. It's sanctioned by the DoD, sanctioned by the U.S. government. Problem is it doesn't work.
Well, let's talk about that for a little bit second. I mean, there's a theoretical reason it might not work. Have you had case studies in how you can see where it goes awry?
Yes, we've done a bunch of research on this, and the research demonstrates conclusively that it goes awry. Let me give you a few examples and try to back up what I'm saying. The risk matrix, the heat map, it's a tool, like a lot of tools. And it's supposed to enable the user to correctly prioritize risks. And risks are typically prioritized based on expected loss theory, where expected loss is the product of the probability and the impact. So far, so good. The problem is that when you try to codify that theory in terms of a matrix, it breaks down horribly. One tenet is that, okay, if you use this tool, if you give this tool to a bunch of different people and ask them to prioritize the same risks, they should come up with the same prioritizations, right? I mean, that makes sense.
If it's a helpful tool.
If it's a helpful tool. The problem is if you give that risk matrix to 20 different people, and if you give them a bunch of risks with the probabilities and the impacts already pre-assigned, you are likely to get 10 to 15 different prioritizations from the 20 different people. And the different prioritizations aren't small, they're sometimes very significant. We did a case study one time where we had about 25 test subjects, n equals 25, and asked them to prioritize 5 risks. And 10 of them came out with risk 2 as the most important, and 5 of them came out with risk 2 as the least important using the risk matrix. So it just does not give you consistent results. Different people get different answers in terms of prioritization. Now look, all risk management is subjective. It's probably impossible to eliminate the subjectivity because when you say what's the probability of a risk occurring, well, that's a subjective response. And even the impact of a risk is also a subjective response. But the tool that you use should not increase the subjectivity. And unfortunately, the heat map risk matrix does just that. It increases the subjectivity. Bad tool.
Where's the impact of having seen this, though? I mean, where does this end up causing us an actual problem? Does this mean we get the mitigation planning wrong, or is it that we just miss risk completely, or is it where do you see the business impact, or where have you heard of this happening?
It can have a terribly negative impact, because if you're using this tool to prioritize risks and you misprioritize the risks, it means you're going to invest a lot of resources and time and effort in solving risks that shouldn't be solved, shouldn't be addressed, and in not addressing risks that should be addressed. And it could have serious financial consequences and even life and death consequences. If the matrix indicates that a catastrophic risk, for example, is low priority, then resources would not be applied to it, and you might experience, unfortunately, the catastrophe. So yeah, it has a lot of real-world, practical, negative implications.
Yeah, I was thinking before that one of the things is that we also don't measure the heat map equally. Like one side is like a kind of a subjective category. I mean, one thing is that our estimation is subjective, I think, is what you were getting at there. But the other one is it's a probability. So you have this huge potential range, right? From it may never ever happen or it shouldn't happen at all up to kind of like existential level impact. So my sense is that what we're doing is we're not really measuring how much I'm afraid.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
and there's actually a risk term for that. It's called dread.
Oh.
Dread. Yeah, it's called dread.
So how does dread play into the model here that you're concerned about?
Well, dread correlates to a degree with the importance of the risk or the priority of the risk. The higher the dread, the higher the priority. And there's some problems associated with that too, because dread is a subjective concept, and what's a dreadful risk to you may not be a dreadful risk to me, because we have different risk propensities or risk aversions. Turns out that can be modeled too, but it turns out that the heat map does not model that at all. But back to your point about the scales, you were talking about the scales of both probability and impact, I think. And yeah, these scales can vary widely. Now, for probability, the scale is bounded by 0 and 1. The only probability of a risk occurring must fall in the range between 0 and 100%. Okay. With impact, though, it's unbounded, because you could have a risk that has an impact of $1 million, or $1 billion, or $1 trillion, or greater than that. And that's one of the problems. You'll find that a lot of these risk matrices are symmetric about the diagonal, which really doesn't make any sense, because you want to have one scale that is bounded by 0 and 100%, and the other scale is not bounded at all.
I'm intrigued why we think we might use it, but but before that, I have a question around something you just said there. It seems like it's not just subjective about how we evaluate risk, but it has a lot to do with who the evaluator is. In other words, it's two levels of subjective happening: what I think it is and how much I care, like how much I feel threatened by it, how I perceive it itself. So there's it's almost like there's two sides here that are moving simultaneously. And I am looking at it as, what do I tell an executive? What do I tell someone who's going to assign resources differently, right? Or give me resources to assign differently. So it strikes me that we've kind of got two parts that are moving. There's no real goalpost here.
Well, you're right. There are two different areas of subjectivity. The first area of subjectivity is, what is the real probability of the risk occurring, and what is the real impact of the risk occurring? And those are subjective because they're perhaps we're limited in terms of our ability to assess those accurately. Okay, that's one side of the subjectivity. The other side of the subjectivity is how much do I fear these risks? How much am I concerned about these risks? And if you're risk prone, you might not be too concerned about a particular risk at all. If you're highly risk averse, you might be very concerned about it. So in answering the question that you just asked, Kendall, how do I convey the risks to an executive or to a decision maker? You have to understand the decision maker's psychology and risk propensity. And there are ways of doing that in terms of, and it's typically measured in terms of a parameter called the risk tolerance. And risk tolerance is different for different entities. And there are risk tolerances for you and me as individuals. There are risk tolerances for corporations. There are risk tolerances for nations. And there are quantitative means, and there are also estimating means of determining risk tolerance for all those different entities.
Do you incorporate that when you've been looking at it yourself in terms of where you might have us go with this, with some different tool? Is risk tolerance something you actually dig into or you suggest people do?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, it's almost foolish to do a risk analysis without assessing an individual's risk propensity, which is analogous to an individual or an entity's utility, because we feel differently about different risks. So you have to incorporate risk tolerance to make a good decision. In order to address the question that you asked a few minutes ago, how do I convey this to the decision maker, to the executive? You must understand the executive's risk tolerance. Otherwise, you can't do an effective job.
Well, that takes me back to a question again about your opening comment, like, I wish I could banish these heat maps. Why do you think they exist? If they don't work and we're not stupid and trillions of dollars are spent in projects around the globe over 7 decades, let's say, or since the 60s, around 50 years, let's say, or whatever it is now, right? So 5-6 decades, everywhere on the globe, how can everyone be wrong? Or why is it that why is this tool existing?
You know, that's a wonderful question, and a question that has plagued me for decades now. So the honest answer is I don't know, but I can speculate. First of all, they're very popular. They've been in use for a long time now. Secondly, they are sanctioned by prestigious organizations like the PMI, like the DoD, like in COSI. The US government uses them. Third, they seem to make logical sense based on the simple logic that risks that have high probability and high impact are more significant than risks that do not. They break down in the implementation of that. Fourth, they're decent communication tools because red is danger, green is safe, just like the stoplight, right? So the decent communication tools. Those are the reasons I can think of, and people are comfortable with them because they've been taught this for years and years and years. So, you know, I'm standing up and saying that the emperor has no clothes, and the reasonable reaction is, well, Jamie, you're going to have to prove that to me.
Well, that's why I was intrigued, because when I hear a tension-creating question like yours or a statement like yours, it makes me think, well, why doesn't anyone see this? Because if your career or your project or your topic, the thing that you're in control of or trying to influence, goes wrong constantly because you're using the wrong tool, it seems to me that somebody would catch on somewhere. So,
well, the thing is, how do you know if it's gone wrong? How do you know
if it was apparent?
So it's usually not apparent. So when you have used this tool to prioritize risks and you say, oh, we got to invest our money and our resources in that risk over there, let's do it, and it's the wrong prioritization, how do you know? So you don't know unless you've done thousands of these and have correlated all the data, looked at the statistics, and gone back. I wish I could go back and acquire data on prioritizations that people have done in the past and find out whether the prioritization has been correct or has been incorrect. Turns out I have not been able to do that, nor do I know anybody who has been able to do that. What I can do, though, is I can give a set of risks to a bunch of people and say, use the tool, use the heat map to prioritize these risks and prove that 20 different people get 10 different answers, dramatically different answers.
Well, maybe because we're not asking the right questions. So given that, right before I bring on another guest here, what would you have us do instead? Because as Hamlet said, I think we tend towards the ills we know, then fly off to the new ones we know not of. So
yes,
I'm comfortable with the pretty colors, and people read it and, you know, they say I'm doing good. So what would you have us do differently? And, you know, then we'll ask, does it work? But we'll start with what would you have us do differently?
And it would be irresponsible for me to be so critical of the conventional tried and true heat map method without proposing an alternative. So we've done that. So actually, I have published a couple of papers that explain how to do this in detail, but let me just tell you the simplified method. It's very straightforward. You have, for each risk, you develop a probability and an impact, just as you do for the heat map. All you have to do is multiply those two together to get an expected loss. The probability of the product of the probability and the impact will give you an expected loss.
So far, so good.
And then all you have to do is to prioritize from the largest expected loss to the smallest expected loss. And if you want to color code them with red for the biggest ones and green for the smallest ones, by all means. It'll be just as clear and it'll be much more accurate. Now that's the simplified version. There's a little twist that you can put onto that to make it more psychologically accurate, and that is you can add risk aversion to it by adding a risk tolerance term. And in my papers, I explain how to do that. It's fairly straightforward as well. But all you have to do, calculate the expected loss by multiplying the probability times the impact and prioritize per that. You'll be miles ahead. Do I know that it works? Yes, I do. And that's because we conducted several field trials with probably 60 or 70 test subjects, asking them to use both techniques in prioritizing risks, both the heat map and the expected loss theory. The expected loss theory generated consistency that was orders of magnitude better than the heat map. Where in the heat map, people use the heat map, you could get 5 people who said risk 2 is the worst, is the most serious risk, and 5 people who said that risk number 2 is the least serious. That never happened with the expected loss calculation. Much, much better consistency using expected loss. People were more comfortable using it, and it was just as clear because you could assign colors just as you can for the heat map.
But I'm trying to see how that one, what you just said, is actually different, because you're using the same product. You're using impact times probability to get an outcome. So in what way is yours different than me putting it on a graph instead of a graph?
Yeah, that's the $64,000 question. The answer is because when you put it on the graph, you translate it into a graphical representation. The translation to the graphical representation is non-prescriptive, and there are no rules for how to do it. For example, how many cells should there be in the matrix? How many different divisions should there be on impact? Should there be low, medium, high? It should be low, low, medium, 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 high, and then high. There are no rules for that. Secondly, how many colors you use? Should there be 3? Green, orange, and red? Should there be 4? Should there be 5? I've seen all kinds. A bigger problem is that the scales can be arbitrary. You can use linear scales, you can use logarithmic scales, exponential scales, etc. Lastly, the boundaries between these divisions. Okay, let's say low impact is 0 to $10 million. Medium impact is $10 million to $50 million. High impact is above $50 million. Totally arbitrary. And my low may be completely different than your low. Let's say that you have a probability designated as low, between 0 and 30% probability. So that one bin, 0 to 30% probability, is defined as low. In that bin, you would have a risk that has a 2% probability, and you'd also have in the same bin a risk that has a 20% probability. An order of magnitude difference in likelihood, yet they're in the same bin. Because of the arbitrariness of the things that I just mentioned, you can actually get prioritization reversal, whereas something that has an expected loss substantially higher than another risk comes out as substantially lower in priority on the risk matrix. It's amazing how this happens.
So it sounds like you're challenging the whole idea of basically bucketizing or categorizing things, because you could still use the heat map to still create ordination. In other words, things in terms of more to less. But it sounds like the scattering across the buckets is partially what you find misleading.
That's largely where the risk matrix breaks down, yes.
Okay. Well, with that, let's bring in another risk expert here, and someone that we have sitting back in our green room, as it were, on off stage, off camera. So let me bring out our Mid-Atlantic guest, Nam Peril. You've seen her you've heard her if you've ever been to a PMI symposium anywhere in the Beltway area. This is Susan Parente. You've heard her, project engineer, consultant, speaker, and author. So, to wit, you must see this big hole I have here. Do you know what that's for?
What's it for?
Susan? That's for you to plug it. So plug your book.
Oh, excellent. Thank you.
We're here. We aim to please. What is this about? Pull it back a little bit. We can't read the whole thing.
Oh, okay. So global hotspots. It is a book on risk management, and it was written by, I think there's 10 of us. There's 9 or 10 authors, and what's fantastic about it, my colleague, Dr. Doug Brown, he put this book together by interviewing us. We wrote chapters. I wrote 2 chapters in the book, but we have all of these different authors who have put their spin on risk management. And you would think that would make it a very discombobulated book, and it does not. It actually has this tremendous semblance of order that all these people from all around the world, because that's actually where the authors are from. I'm actually residing in the Delaware area. I do most of my work in the DC area, but we all contributed to that book. And if you read the book, you're like, wow, how can all these people in all these different places kind of be saying the same thing? So it's a really exquisite book insofar as it gives a lot of different thoughts, different perspectives, and it all seems to come together.
Well, actually, that's what intrigues me a little bit. As we heard earlier, there's kind of a standard. The guardians tell us what risk and what some typical tools are for us to use and how we should think about them. We've had other guests talk about basically there's a cognitive approach to some of this too, how we get queued up to think about risk matters and working in teams. So we've heard about that some. But when you say you have this book with 10 different authors, what are the different perspectives that you're hearing here? I mean, how complicated can it be? We're hearing don't use a heat map maybe, but it's still probability times impact. So talk to me.
Well, don't use a heat map is kind of controversial, and I don't know if I should touch that one or not. But the interesting thing is this is not a risk 101 book. This is more like risk in your enterprise, or how do I use agile risk management, or what does agile risk management mean? It's basically the subtitle is how enterprise and project risk management practices generate business results around the world. So you're not talking about a chapter out of the PMBOK guide on risk management. This is really of applied risk management, how we're using it in different organizations, how we're using it around the world, what's working, what's not working, and how businesses use risk management to actually achieve their strategic objectives. So it's a little bit at a different level than using a heat map or not. So it's very interesting.
Well, we don't want to give away all the author's stuff in there, but what's the punchline for you? What did you find interesting when you got to read your colleagues around that in terms of how it drives business value?
What was interesting to me is how it's like the scene of a crime. So, everybody sees a crime occur and we all have our own perspective on it. And then we talk about our perspectives and you're like, some things are aligned, some things are not. But when you look at it all together, you're like, oh, I think I got the story. I think I know what's going on here. So that's what I found to be interesting. It was like the scene of the crime being perhaps poorly managed risk.
Oh, so at least we should manage it. So we know that part. So let's talk about your experience with this from a project manager's perspective. And I know you teach on many of these things, and you mentioned agile risk as well. Read us in a little bit. What was your part of, well, we can even think about it from the book's perspective. What was your contribution? What is your contribution to the risk dialogue? Because the audience, they do be wanting to know.
Okay, well, I am just a risk lover, so to speak, which sounds crazy, but like yourself, I was actually noting some things that you said, Kendall. They were awesome. That basically, risk management is really what we're doing as project managers. We've got our scope, we've got our schedule, we've got our cost, we've got quality, and all of those have uncertainty. So what are we going to do? Right. So after we plan things, we talk about risk. No, that doesn't make any sense. When we're estimating our scope, when we're estimating our schedule, when we're estimating our costs, when we're talking about quality, that's when we want to actually do risk identification and start our risk management. And too often I see people think about risk as an afterthought. So clearly, I consider us as project managers being jugglers. We're juggling time, cost, and scope while making sure we maintain quality. And how do we do that? Well, we do it by risk management. And is actually you can YouTube Susan Parente juggling risk management, and you will see a video of me juggling before a presentation many years ago. So,
was something dangerous?
no, scarves.
Oh, okay. That's not that risky.
Scarves are easier to juggle than balls because they drop slower. That's the trick. I actually learned it from a registered instructional clown who works at Barnum and Bailey's school for teaching clowns and jungling. So he actually taught me. He was a friend of a colleague of mine, is a clown that a professor.
We talked about the requirements for lateral thinking in our True Talks number 13. So those of you that want to go check into that, you can. So there we have with lateral thinking. But take me to agile risk. How is that different? And what is the approach that you've seen there that seems to be effective?
So agile risk is interesting. So agile, first of all, that is one chapter in the book that I discuss. And the challenge there is that a lot of people don't talk about risk management in agile, but it's so inherently there. So first of all, why do we use an agile approach? We use an agile approach because there's so much scope uncertainty. That's why something becomes an agile project. Because we say, we have so much scope uncertainty. How are we going to deal with this? And you say, I know, let's use this approach where our scope does not need to be solidified at the beginning of the project. So right there, risk management is inherent. Also, we get to our iteration planning. How are we picking what to do when? Well, we're looking at the risks. What is the benefit of doing this now, doing this later? When we do our daily stand-up meeting, what are my impediments? What are my barriers? Well, there's your risk management. We do our retrospective. What went wrong and what should we do next time? Well, we're identifying risks based on issues that arose, and what should we do next time is the other part of that. And so I've actually tried to make the conversation for agile risk management to be more outspoken instead of sort of under the grain and not really talked about. And that's, most people with agile just won't talk about risk. And I think that that's a mistake. I think we need to be explicit about talking about risk if we want to manage our projects well, whether they be traditional or agile.
Before I bring Jamie back in, I wanted to ask you something that I heard actually from our host up there, Beth. Beth May was talking about one of the best projects she ever worked on was something where they had essentially tiered risk. There were essentially subcontractors working on subcomponents that led up to components. And she was personally impressed with how that got integrated. In the projects that you've seen, because you talk in your bio about these large-scale IT software, IT implementations, have you seen a tiered risk approach that's good or bad? What do we need to watch out for there when we look at those kinds of layers or tiers?
Well, that to me gets into the space of enterprise risk management. So you have your project risks, and I've usually seen it like in a pyramid where you have project risks at the bottom, program risks. You may or may not have portfolio risks depending on how you're managing, if you're using portfolios or programs. And then at the very top, you have your enterprise risks. So I do agree that that's a great way to manage them. There can be consistency across the board in the organization. One of the great programs that I worked on, I supported a program management office at Census Bureau, and I basically put together a risk management program that all of the projects use so that there'd be consistency. So actually some of the things that came out with Jamie about consistency of assessing risks, if you have a consistent approach for assessment, you're going to get rid of some of those challenges. If you include more people in the assessment, you're going to get rid of some of that. Also, there's an escalation method. So let's say you're working on a project that's part of a program. You see that risk is not just about your project. Maybe you don't have the resources, or you don't have the responsibility or accountability to make decisions or make plans for how to deal with that risk, you're then going to escalate it to the program level. Maybe at the program level, they realize it's really more of an enterprise risk and the program doesn't have the authority or resources to manage it. And so I think that's what Beth is talking about. And that is really powerful because a lot of times we'll come up with risks for our projects that really aren't our project risks. They are risks, but they're not about our project. They're about a program, they're about a portfolio, or they're about the enterprise. And being able to distinguish those and raise them to the right level where they can be dealt with by whomever has the resources and authority to deal with them is going to be really powerful.
Yeah, this is the above my pay grade level kind of comment, right? So it's not about whether I see the risk or not. It's whether I would have the resources to appropriately mitigate it or address it, perhaps more broadly. So with that, I'm going to bring Jamie back in. Jamie, you still lurking? Dan will tell us if Jamie's lurking or not. Dan, is Jamie still lurking out there? There he is.
I'm lurking.
No longer lurking. He's up on stage. So let's talk about a couple of things here. So from each of you, how would you suggest people start the conversations on risk then? So how should we be thinking about it such that we get to a tool of meaning? It's not just about how we start a tool. Go ahead.
I like to start with why. I mean, that's Simon Sinek is a huge fan of mine when he wrote that book, Start With Why. I feel like there's a lot of focus in risk management with starting with how. How do we manage the risk? What do we do? What process do we use? What tool do we use? Why don't we start with why? Because the why should be driving the tools that we're using, who's involved, who are the stakeholders, and how we're doing all of it, instead of starting with the how or even the what, which are the risks themselves. Let's start with why.
You mean, why should we manage risk, or why are we looking at these risks? So what was the underlying driver for it?
Well, why are we managing risks? Why is that important for this project or this program? And that should drive the things that we do, rather than just being driven by, okay, these are the steps, let's just do them. Think about what is the driving purpose. Also, because I find when people just get focused on the what and the how, then they'll do silly things like make a list of risks, assess them, prioritize them, and then never actually implement a plan. They might even come up with a plan, but they don't implement it. And if you're focused on the why, you would never do that. But if you're focused on the what and the how, sure. I've seen plenty of people write these beautiful risk registers, and then you come back in a few months and they just have a big issue log. So they didn't really manage risk by identifying risk and assessing it.
I want to get into that in just a second, but Jamie, how about you? How would you suggest people kick off their discussions of risk? How do they begin to face risk on a project?
Well, I like what Susan said, and I endorse just about everything that she said. I like to start off with the psychology of risk and understanding the psychology of risk, because again, it's so different depending on the entity with whom you're dealing, the decision maker who's involved. Daniel Kahneman just wrote this beautiful book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which explains a lot about the psychology of risk. One of the most fascinating aspects of it, he developed with Tversky decades ago, prospect theory, which indicates that we don't feel the same about gains as we feel about losses. In fact, losses hurt us about twice as much psychologically as do gains. In other words, we feel a loss of $100 hurts us twice as much as the pleasure of a gain of $100, which is fascinating to me. Why does the human brain work that way? So before you can really get into managing risk, I think you need to understand the psychology, what motivates people, what causes dread, what causes them to react to risks in specific ways.
Do you have tools to be thinking about how to, and you might find this thought-provoking for yourself too, Susan, on this, or what you've seen. How do we get to identify that dread or that tolerance level? What is a structured way to approach the tolerance level? I would imagine it's of the layer above us in the layering that you gave us, Susan, or maybe it's all the way to the top. But what is the method for extracting that and to make that, I would use the word consumable in my risk management?
Yeah, so that's very interesting. So there's a few things there. First of all, Daniel's book is awesome. If you don't have time to read, get it in audiobook. And if you really want to get into risk management, Thinking Fast and Slow is an awesome book, and it is a little heady, but you don't have to read it all at once or listening to the audiobook all at once. So yes, I agree with that. It's very much about the culture and how people think of risk. Now, when it comes to assessing somebody's risk, the best description I ever had of what we mean by this, actually assessing their risk appetite or their risk tolerance.
Yeah.
When you sit down with your investment counselor and they say, what's your tolerance for your investment? Are you risk seeking, risk averse, or risk neutral? And they show you these charts and they talk to you about things. That's kind of what we're talking about. And everybody's going to score differently on that. And what I try to do on my projects or programs is I say, especially as like a contractor, you're not looking for your personal tolerance or appetite for risk. You're looking for what is the organization's tolerance or appetite for risk. So for example, one of my colleagues worked at DARPA and he said, we eat risk for breakfast. So obviously DARPA is going to be risk seeking because they're in an innovative research-based organization, whereas maybe HUD is going to be more risk averse. Right. So I try to get out of my personal reaction to risk and I look at what is the organization or the project's reaction to it, which is not easy to do. And I'm sure Jamie's going to say, how do you do that? If you're risk averse and your organization is risk seeking, how do you properly assess? And I think that's some of the challenges that he was bringing up before. So I can see that this is a major problem because everybody has that sort of different bias they're coming from. Really what you're talking about is getting rid of your own biases or putting them aside so that your assessment can align with other people's assessment and you can find out what's the true appetite for risk for the organization when you're assessing your risks.
Jamie, how would you approach getting that assessment driven out? Making that information consumable?
So again, Susan has hit the nail on the head. You need to assess the risk tolerance, the risk propensity, the risk aversion of the entity for whom you are making the decisions. Okay, so it's not and how you feel about it personally, it's how the decision makers feel, it's how the board of directors of the corporation feel. So one way you can do this, a simple-minded but effective way of doing this, is you invent a hypothetical risk. And suppose that hypothetical risk is, let's say the corporation has a 10% risk of losing $1 million. So you do the simple multiplication, the expected loss is 10% of $1 million, expected loss is $100,000. And then you say to the board of directors, suppose I have the ability to remove this risk from your company completely. How much would you be willing to pay me to remove that risk? Now, if the entity is risk neutral, they're going to say, I'd be willing to pay you $100,000, which is the expected loss. If they are risk averse, they're going to say, I'm willing to pay you more than $100,000. And exactly how risk averse they are will correlate with how much more the risk premium that they're willing to pay. If they are risk prone, like as Susan said, the example that we eat risk for breakfast, they're willing to pay you somewhat less than the expected loss of $100,000. And by posing questions like that, you can determine the risk tolerance, which is a dollar figure. And then you can actually use that risk tolerance to model their risk psychology, which is to me astounding. You can actually model how people think psychologically about risk by using this risk tolerance term in utility functions.
So you mean you're going to take it to math to determine what then? So now that we know this, when you say model, what do you mean?
So what you want to do is you want to calculate the expected loss of a particular risk in order to prioritize them, in order to decide how many resources you should assign to them. Well, the simple-minded way is expected loss equals the product of probability times impact. That does not account for risk aversion. To account for risk aversion, you must add a risk aversion term. And the risk tolerance goes into this risk aversion term. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. And that's what's identified in your paper.
Yes,
that you can walk through that to understand that. Well, I want to challenge. I want to challenge another question here because we talked a little about this before. The opposite of risk is opportunity. So maybe some of the people listening on the call or watching on YouTube will experience this as a CEO who has to bid projects. I have a portfolio, and people tell me I'm supposed to be able to show, my advisors, what is my portfolio of the potential wins that I have during the year. What is your expected upside? What is your, essentially, it's not a pro forma, it's the step beyond that, which is what are you expecting to receive? And I went for years using the wrong structure, which was probability times impact. In other words, the probability in this case of a win times the size of the revenue of the win, which is in theory what you were just laying out there. Now I could be able to determine which projects therefore were bigger to chase. So I could put ordination. I could rank them one to the bottom, right? In terms of what I might chase. Or in the case of risk, it would be inversion of that. Which ones I really am most worried about, right? Well, I guess it's the same thing. I'm looking for the one I want to focus on. So I could do that, but I found out it was not predictive of my actual outcomes. And for years, I found, as I used to tell my staff, after we do all of this and I bother to look at it a year in hindsight, I look at my pipeline and what its risk adjusted or probability of win adjusted was, I found out that the one thing I knew was the number I came up was absolutely nowhere near the actual thing that happened, both high or low. So I found out that actually it was almost like taking an average of averages. I was tricking myself into thinking we have a good, robust pipeline, or to put it in risk terms, oh boy, we have a lot of risks that we're facing here that we could have some downside. So I found what I needed to do was to move to thresholds. So I'm still monitoring how big it is, but I only care about the ones that are actually of a certain size, because a win or a risk either happens or it doesn't. It doesn't happen 70% of it. To me, the whole product concept, the idea of multiplying impact times probability, is itself flawed. And I put it in the category of giving a category of sneakily showing precision over accuracy. It looks precise, it looks lovely, but I don't even think it helps me. Discuss.
Well, that's like hail damage in your house, right? So you'd say, what's the probability of it is 0.1. What's the impact? I don't know, $10,000 to replace your siding. So what does that tell you? Well, it doesn't tell you a whole lot. If you have hail damage, you need $10,000.
Right.
If you don't have hail damage, you don't need $10,000. So it's never going to be 0.1 times $10,000, which would be $1,000.
Right.
However, actuaries use this, insurance companies use this for premiums, because what they're saying is, well, if you're going to have hail damage once every 20 years, we're going to collect $20,000 to make sure that one time you get it will pay out your $10,000. So the casinos versus insurance companies, either one always wins, right? But you're right. So when you multiply those, you get 1,000. 1,000 doesn't mean anything. It's a one or done. It's either you have hail damage or you don't. You don't have $1,000 worth of hail damage. You know, generally speaking, unless it maybe hit one side of the house. But you are correct in that it's a squirrely way of doing things. And I remember noticing this myself when you calculate the expected monetary value for all your risks and you add them up. What if they all happen? What if you're just that unlucky? You will not have enough money. That is not enough contingency reserve by adding up all the expected monetary value. You're actually hoping that all the things don't happen.
And hope is not a business strategy. What do you think, Jamie?
No.
So to put it in slightly different terms, expected loss theory works very well when you're dealing with distributed data, as Susan says. An insurance company is dealing with distributed data, not individuals, but thousands or hundreds of thousands of individuals for whom you can add up the products of all the probabilities and impacts, and you get a total, and you're going to be right. most of the time pretty closely because you're dealing with so many different individual risks, thousands and thousands of them. So when you distribute all the risks like that, on the average, the central limit theorem says you're going to be closer to the mean. And that works beautifully for distributed data. It breaks down when you're talking about unique data, which is what you're talking about, Kendall, for your own particular company.
There we go.
And in that situation, I totally agree with you that a threshold approach is much, much better. For example, you have a bunch of opportunities. You might have 20 different opportunities ranging in dollar potential and probability. And multiplying the two together and adding them all up to give you, hey, this is what I'm going to make this year, that's ridiculous, okay? But your threshold approach where you say, hey, you know what? It either happens or it doesn't. It doesn't happen 70%. You might use a threshold and say, okay, I'm only going to tally up all those opportunities that I think have a probability of greater than 80% of occurring, and tally those up, and this is what I think is my profitability going to be for the coming year. And that's a reasonable approach. Now, if you're much less conservative, if you're much more optimistic, you might set your threshold at only 50% probability or 30% probability. But that's up to you, again, depending on how optimistic you feel. But this threshold approach, I think, is a much better way of projecting the results of unique data.
That begins to smack to me of a heat map, because I've got a category of space. Well, I have a category of space that I'm putting some in that I'm choosing to pay more attention to, those above a certain threshold. But I think the key there was the distributed versus unique, possibly. So let me ask you this, though. Whatever tool we move forward on, is it your experience either through the study or as you've talked to other professionals or you've run projects yourselves, that there's like a taboo about talking about risk? Like you're not really supposed to show it? Because what I have experienced now, so I'm not presuming the question. What I'm actually saying is I've experienced it. You mentioned it, Susan. You see the risk register and it starts looking bad. And so we either change how it looks or we put that away and change it to another way of looking at risk or something. Like it's almost like now that we've invested all this money to find it out, I don't want to talk about it. Or is that just kind of the space that I'm in?
No, as the space that I see it, I mean that includes private sector and public sector. I've had people say, yeah, so that we have too many high risk. Can you make some of those medium? I'm like, they're not medium. Like I don't know what to tell you.
Medium?
Like,
well, isn't that the whole point of risk management?
Well, I mean, they don't mean by doing a risk response strategy that properly reduces it. They just mean like, oh, I just have a feeling that they're medium, which is one reason why qualitative risk analysis is poor. And I think that that's what Jamie was getting to, is that a qualitative risk assessment is, it's like a person that needs glasses with their glasses off, and they're just kind of like, it looks like a 1, maybe a 2, I don't know. Whereas like a quantitative risk assessment is going to be, I don't know if accurate's the right word, because the probability part is crazy. Like it's just a pure guess. Look at the weather. I mean, you look at the weather every day and you're like, there's a 10% chance of rain. What does that mean? Does that mean is only 10% of the rain's going to fall on my house? Or does that mean, again, it's like it's either going to rain or it's not going to rain. So the 10% chance, again, it's distributed over an area that you live in. And I've watched, like where I live, there's not a lot of mountains. So you can actually go look at the radar, and then you can come back a half an hour later, look at the radar, and that cloud that looked like it was coming to you is now not. So it's like some, that's how we're doing weather. So the whole idea of accuracy with risk management is a bit humorous. Like we can't accurately predict the weather. So how can we accurately predict any of these things, right?
I liked your idea about the qualitative versus quantitative, maybe what we're hitting on here. But you'd mentioned, Jamie, this idea of the concept of dread. To me, it's like the fear of talking about the things we dread keeps us from actually doing something to make it consumable. Back to my thought, we're not driving decisions. I don't know what we're doing. Thoughts? 1 minute.
Yeah. A lot of corporations have exactly the opposite attitude towards risk management that I think they should have, which is to say that they tend to suppress risks. They want to suppress risks. They're afraid of identifying these risks. And as Susan was saying, they'll say, hey, that's too high a risk. Let's move that down from high to medium without any basis for it. And I have sat in risk management discussions and meetings where people are identifying risks and the senior managers say, oh, you're too pessimistic. You don't have to worry about that risk. Exactly the opposite of approach that should be taken. These meetings should identify all the risks and bring them to the surface, get them all out, and then deal with them, as opposed to suppressing them to make the company or the project or the portfolio look better than it actually is, look less risky than it actually is. You're not going to get anywhere by suppressing risks that are real.
Well, let me close in with this for both of you. We heard about the book there, Susan. How can people get hold of you, find out how to learn from you, find out what you're writing about, and follow up with you?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Susan Parente. You'll see, it looks like I'm in the DC area. I think there's a bridge behind my picture, and I look like the intro picture of me with my hair back, not the hair down version of me.
Do you blog?
So,
do you blog or publish regularly online?
I do publish regularly, but I don't have my own blog site. I publish on other people's sites. But if you reach out to me on LinkedIn, I can send you where I publish. I write on risk management and agile often. I also teach, as you know, at 3 universities and do consulting work. I kind of just do a little bit of everything. I teach certifications. I teach risk management certification. I teach even IT security certification. So that's a whole nother world of cybersecurity.
I will see you at the next symposium. I'll see you in the next symposium where we end up sitting in the back room somewhere having coffee and talking about what's going on in the symposium. Dr. Jamie Monad, how can people follow up with you and get your papers?
Email me, please, jmonat@wpi.edu. That's JMONAT@wpi.edu. I always respond to emails. I don't blog. I'm technologically challenged, according to my family, but I do respond to emails.
Excellent, excellent. The low risk way to reach out to you. So with that, Beth, come on up and take us out.
All right. That was a great discussion. I had personally was surprised by some of it, and definitely got me thinking. And I think that's the whole point, right? So thank you. I have a few announcements from the chapters before we wrap up. And I can't tell if the slide is up. No, are you going to bring up the slide for Southern Maryland on November 30th? There's a book club meeting. On December 13th is the annual membership meeting. It will be virtual. On February 18th is the Project Management Day of Service. And the next True Talks with Project Managers will be in 2023, and that schedule will be announced soon. The next slide should be the PMI WDC chapter information. On November 28th is the member orientation webinar. On December 6th is the Fair Lakes Luncheon. And on December 13th is the monthly book club. And finally, don't forget to submit your PDU claim for tonight. Thank you so much for joining. See you next time.
Thank you.